Welcome to the Kuits webinar on building resilience in the leisure and hospitality sector. My name's Felicity Tulloch and I head up the licensing team at Kuits. Just by way of background, Kuits is a full service law firm with specific expertise when it comes to leisure and hospitality. We act for hotels, bars, restaurants, theatres, event spaces up and down the country. And we've been working through the last 8 months trying to continue to support those in the sector as they've been so badly hit, perhaps almost uniquely so, and the challenges are far from over. The sector's faced an almost constant deluge of new rules and regulations. It started in mid-March when the government advised that members of the public should not go to hospitality venues. That then resulted in a lockdown at the end of the month, and then a gradual reopening of the sector in early July. Some premises have never been able to open, such as nightclubs, and it remains to be seen whether they're able to survive the current situation in the long term. But premises have had to adapt, make themselves COVID secure, and once they had done that, then followed the curfew, the tier system, and now the lockdown that we're currently in and that's due to run for another 3 or so weeks. Some figures have just been released, which show that 1/3 of hospitality business were closed by the end of October. So even before the current lockdown started, there was still a significant number of premises that were closed. And estimates forecast that 40% are predicted not to reopen ever again, which is a pretty crushing statistic and demonstrates what a dire situation it is out there for many operators. City centres particularly are going to be hardest hit, I think, if the hospitality sector doesn't bounce back when it's allowed to. The whole ecosystem of a city centre almost hangs off the hospitality sector. And I think that's going to be really damaged going forward. So against that pretty bleak backdrop, we've assembled a panel of experts from within Kuits to talk about how businesses can perhaps use this current lockdown as a period of reflection, start to take some time out and look forward to see how they might build back when they're allowed to reopen. So myself, as I've already mentioned, together with Kevin, who heads our employment team, Becky Bainbridge, who's an associate in our commercial team, Andrew Knight from our commercial property team, who specialises in advising tenants, and Richard Palmer, our head of restructuring and insolvency. So we're going to kick things off first by speaking with Richard on the subject of resilience and the importance of communication. Richard, you're an insolvency specialist. Presumably you're expecting to see an increase in the number of companies getting into difficulty if you haven't already?
Yes, I think that's certainly a risk next year. I think this year, counterintuitively, the number of companies entering formal insolvency has actually gone down significantly. I think that's because of the government support that's available to companies. So in this sector, the Insolvency Service has some statistics, and about 1,800 companies went into a formal insolvency in the last 12 months. That was to the end of September, and I think that's because of the government support at this stage. I mean, as we all know, at the best of times, this is a highly competitive sector with fairly tight margins and high fixed costs, so rent on premises, for example. So I do think, unfortunately, going into 2021, when the support may reduce or run out completely, that there's going to be some problems here next year.
Lots of the sector at the moment are closed, which might give a period of reflection and maybe a bit more breathing space to think about other things and perhaps the future of their business. Where do you think those operators are best using their time now?
I think that obviously operators are going to want to try and preserve the business as much as possible. and try and make it more profitable as things improve next year. I think the most important thing for directors trying to turn around these companies is to communicate with stakeholders. That's the most important thing, and having access to the most up-to-date and correct information that you can have. They're the two absolutely fundamentals, I'd say. So making sure you know your financial position as much as you can, and liaising with people, speaking to them. I mean, at the moment, in terms of financial position, know what grants you can get, know what loans you can get to finance operations. You know, the furlough scheme, which will help reduce costs. I know that you can get reliefs on business rates. There's certain VAT reliefs that have been available in the past. I think make sure you know what they are and apply for them as soon as possible. It's all about preserving your cash flow, which is what you're trying to do with using those reliefs. In terms of payments to make, I'd focus on business critical ones. That's really important. How you decide what is business critical will depend on each case. So, you know, if you own the freehold of the premises and there's a bank that's got a charge, paying the bank is almost certainly a critical one, because banks can still, you know, enforce on property in the commercial setting. And in terms of helping you decide which payments are business critical and monitoring the financial position, I'd say speak to your advisors. I mean, accountants, your accountant, I imagine, will be very well versed in deciding what helping you decide what a business critical payment is. And so engage with them, use their expertise. Obviously, lawyers can as well, but I'd just use whatever expertise was available to you to try and do that.
Thanks, Richard. Andrew, if I can just bring you in, as someone who acts for tenants, could you just give an overview of what you're seeing at the moment?
Well, at the moment, the government have introduced legislation whereby there's a moratorium on forfeiture. So landlords can't forfeit before the 31st of December this year. And the intention of that is to get the landlords and the tenants to start negotiating and looking at these rents. Because the traditional position is always that the rent is payable come what may. It doesn't matter whether there's a recession or whether there's a lockdown. All leases, most leases will contain provisions that require tenants to pay. So what we're seeing now is tenants going to their landlords and trying to negotiate something, because landlords have a dilemma, because their ultimate sanction of forfeiture has been taken away. But even when it comes back, if they forfeit a lease, it just means that they are liable for rates, etc. And obviously, unless they can get a new tenant to come in, they're not going to do that. And from a landlord's perspective, it is better to keep tenants afloat, paying something, even if it's only rates, than it is to forfeit leases and to make the tenants insolvent. So what we're seeing is landlords and tenants negotiating with each other and trying to seek reductions in the rent.
And presumably those negotiations, if they lead to alternative agreements and a different way of working together going forward, I guess it's important that both parties make those agreements legally binding.
Yeah, so what we're finding is that the first and most obvious one is a reduction in the rent, and that's obviously the hardest to agree. The second one is tenants using money that's held on a rent deposit deed. So the landlord can take the money now, and that they're agreeing maybe in 6 months, 12 months time that they will replenish that money going forward, just so it gives people a better cash flow. Also, if a tenant feels that their business is viable in the longer term, what they're doing is they're removing, say, breaks or entering into new leases, but to give the landlord something, but at the same time, they're taking a rent reduction in the meantime. So they're kind of offering the landlord something in the longer term whilst they get a cash flow boost in the short term. And also, it's worth pointing out that where where you took over a lease, where you took an assignment of a lease from a former tenant, that former tenant is usually still on the hook under a guarantee. So when you will find that the parties should come together and try and share the pain amongst them. So the landlord will take a bit of a hit on the rent, and the guarantor, who will have to step in and take the lease back, may have to pay some money in, just so we can keep everything afloat and everyone keep going. So they're the four types of things we're seeing people negotiate at the moment.
Thanks, Andrew. And Becky, if I can now come to you. You specialise in commercial contracts and that sort of thing. Suppliers to the hospitality sector have been incredibly badly hit as well. And they often don't have the same amount of support that's been given directly to the operators. So there's obviously an interesting relationship between those two sort of sides of the equation. Is there any advice that you can give to operators about that relationship, and whether, you know, again, during this lockdown, there could be, you know, a period of reflection whilst those might be looked at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important during this period for operators to carry out a contractual audit and establish where they've got ongoing obligations to another party. As you've already said, a number of suppliers have been equally as hard hit as operators, because if the operators aren't purchasing, then their cash flows down as well. So it's actually a good opportunity to think about approaching your suppliers, potentially with a counter offer of what you can offer them to agree a variation to terms. So where you identify a contract which is a key contract like Richard spoke about before, but it's one where there's quite a heavy outlay at the minute which you might be struggling to meet, it's worth thinking, is there something else I can offer this supplier in exchange for potentially getting better terms now? So an example of the types of contracts we'd be talking about would be, for example, long-term drinks arrangements such as beer suppliers, any hire agreements you've got, so any kind of coffee machines or kitchen equipment, or also service providers such as waste collection or cleaning services, for example. It's worth having a look at those and thinking, what are these terms and where am I struggling to meet them? And things you can go to the supplier with, by way of example, would be to offer perhaps to agree to a longer term for that contract, so extend the term in exchange for having lower monthly or quarterly or weekly or whatever it may be payments. And that's something which the supplier will be able to look at and say, it's better for us perhaps to get those lower payments now than for them to be in breach of contract, and equally to then be able to also get a longer commitment for those people. On the other side of things as well, there will, as Richard has said, will be contracts which you simply look at them and think they're not business critical anymore. So it's also worthwhile having a look at those and having a look at the termination rights in those contracts. What we would say on that is it can often be more expensive to terminate a contract wrongly than to continue with the contract. So it's really important to make sure that you're looking at exactly what the termination clauses say, and abiding by those to the letter. So if there's any doubt as to how you might be able to correctly terminate a contract, you should seek advice before you go and try and do anything, because that's much more cost efficient in the long term.
Thanks, Becky. I want to pick up that theme with Kevin, and making sure you do things correctly, because I'm guessing, Kevin, that you've been advising a lot of people and businesses at the moment around redundancy and that sort of thing. And I know that if that's not done right, then you can build up problems further down the line.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the whole theme of this is about resilience in very difficult times. And the last thing any business wants to do is to take a bad situation and then make it worse by perhaps, if they're going through a redundancy process, and there may well be, and there often will be, a genuine redundancy situation that you have, but you can still fall foul if you just get the process wrong, or if you end up selecting people on grounds that you're not entitled to. So absolutely, you don't want to take the situation and then find that you're on the end of one or more employment tribunals with all the cost implications that you have from that. You're right.
I want to go back to Richard and just talk about what happens if things get really bad, because it is a sad fact that lots of businesses now will be wondering whether they will be able to ride the current situation out and emerge on the other side of it intact. So I just wondered if you had any advice for operators when it comes to considering, the very existence of their business.
Yeah, in the very short term, linking to what Andrew said before about the suspension on forfeiture, there is a suspension effectively on winding up petitions being presented for current debt. I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but in practice, it's difficult for a creditor to seek to wind up an operator's company, where it's a company with individuals that remains unaffected. If things get really bad, though, an operator may decide that they want to start again with a new company, and given the situation that is being faced by a lot of operators, I couldn't blame them if they did that, to be honest. I mean, the right approach that they would take would depend upon the size of the company. I mean, I'm not a licensed insolvency practitioner, so I can't give specific advice, but can talk through the principles here. I mean, if it's a small company, a liquidation is probably the way forward. And there's a couple of practical issues if you went down a liquidation route and wanted to start again. The first is the landlord, negotiating with a landlord who may not be too keen to lose rent that is due from the old company, and secondly is starting again in a compliant fashion. If you're trading with the same or a very similar name with the new company, you'd want to make sure that you didn't fall foul of the Insolvency Act, which is potentially a criminal offence if you did that. So, but it's straightforward enough to resolve. But making sure you do that is absolutely vital. With a larger operator with several venues, for example, you may look at an administration of that company, because that might be a more appropriate way of bringing landlords on board, subject to the new rules that are coming in next year about sales of businesses out of administration to connected parties. Of course, if a termination by insolvency happens, there are a couple of pitfalls. One is the license may lapse upon insolvency, and you want to make sure that that's dealt with. And also, Becky was talking about contracts generally, and there are termination provisions. There's provisions that have come in recently where suppliers may not be able to automatically terminate for insolvency of the customer, and that just may be something to be aware of if the option was to use insolvency and start again.
And Kevin, coming back to you, if things get really bad for an employer, what should they be thinking about now if they're facing the reality that they might not be able to survive it?
Well, I imagine lots of employers will have had plenty of time to give that a good deal of thought, given how long, I suppose, we've gone through this. You sort of outlined the journey of this already, so operators will have been through that. Many operators, I suppose, will be thinking, well, furlough gives us a lifeline, the reintroduction there, and for some operators that will be the case. But I suppose as time goes on, it may well be that for a lot of businesses that they're going to build up more liabilities. So as people are going through, continuing their length of service, they're going to be accruing holiday. They might be clicking into redundancy entitlements, getting longer notice periods. All of these things businesses need to think about, that building liability when they may have little or no income to meet it. One of the things that we know about the reintroduction of the furlough scheme is that, unlike in the past, employers won't be able to use furlough money to pay out notice, where that notice is given after the 1st of December. So you need to think about those things as well. it looks like a lifeline. For many businesses, it will be a lifeline. For others, it might just end up building more liabilities for them. So they need to think carefully about that.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to turn this into a more positive chat now and start to think about where there might be some opportunities, because obviously where there are threats, there are always opportunities. I think from an operator's perspective and a licensing perspective, we certainly saw some pent-up demand over the summer and the early autumn, where bars and restaurants were allowed to reopen. Perhaps those plans that had been put on hold to, open new bars back in March were starting to come back. And I think that will happen again. I think once this lockdown has ended, and perhaps there might be a move away from the tier system, perhaps the removal of the curfew in some parts of the country, that will mean that bars and restaurants will be better able to take advantage of what I think will be a pent-up demand from customers. It's one of the few things that you can't recreate at home. You can shop online, for example, and lots of premises during lockdown went into alternative sort of business ideas and revenue streams, from doing meal kit delivery things at home to turning gin into hand sanitizer. Those things are always possible, but I think it's people want and will want to go out with their friends once things improve. And so I think there are certain things that operators can do now to make sure that they're better placed to take advantage of that when that time comes. So I would always recommend looking now at premises licenses, seeing if they're still fit for purpose, seeing whether or not later hours can be obtained. If you can't open later on into the evening, perhaps sort of bring the hours forward earlier into the morning to take advantage of a growing brunch market, for example. So there's certainly those sorts of things which that can be done. Many councils are looking to remove their cumulative impact policies. We've seen it happen in a number of cities, notably Bristol. A cumulative impact policy is a policy brought in by a local authority which creates a presumption against the grant of new licenses or the grant of later hours for existing licenses. So if those are being removed, I think because some local authorities have identified the need to encourage operators into their area and encourage that investment, then now's the time to vary your license, because the backdrop is probably more welcoming than it has been for a long time. And I think capitalising on outdoor spaces, perhaps not going into December, but the Business and Planning Act was brought in at the end of July, and that allowed premises and automatic entitlement to off sales if they didn't have it already. And it also introduced pavement licenses, so a quick and often free way of incorporating outdoor space with the licensed premises to take advantage of sort of increasing capacity that way. And we saw a huge uptake in that over the summer. The legislation was initially brought in for a 15-month period, and it was going to expire. So the ability to have off sales and the ability to apply for pavement licenses was going to run until the end of September 2021. But just in the last week or so, it's been announced that that's now going to run until March 2022, which might be a sign of where the government think things might be going in terms of restrictions. But it is a positive piece of legislation that operators can take advantage of for even longer now, which will give greater certainty, which is always good. Andrew, in terms of the market going forward, do you think there's anything positive for tenants on the horizon?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you've got the money to survive the short term, it will be a tenant's market. There will be lots of chances to take on premises that may have already been fitted out to a high standard, and you can go in and get a real opportunity to negotiate long rent-free periods, breaks, and even in the short term, COVID suspension clauses, because, as I said, landlords will want something rather than nothing. Even if it's just to get rid of the rates liabilities for them, it's worth it. So, I mean, if you can survive it, certainly there are some great deals to be had if you're a tenant and you want to expand at the moment.
And Richard, I know you think that things are probably, in terms of insolvency, going to get worse before they get better, but is there anything that operators might be able to take advantage of?
I think Andrew's point's absolutely valid. We've started to see on a few occasions prospective buyers of premises taking near fitted out premises and getting them a lot cheaper than they may have done at ordinary times. I think one opportunity in terms of cash flow and having cash to get through the worst of the next few months is the government recently announced an extension to its CBILS loan program, where you can apply for loans now until the 31st of January next year. That program had come to an end over the summer, and it's been brought back. So that may be an opportunity to get you through the worst.
Thanks, Richard. And Becky, coming to you, is there anything that you can see that might, help operators flourish, perhaps in the next couple of months?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the innovative ways that leisure companies are now operating to get around some of the restrictions that they're subject to, I think they'll certainly continue for the short term and perhaps even for the long term. So a couple of key ones we're seeing which are interesting are operator and brand collaborations. So what you often see is a restaurant or a food operator allowing a drinks only operator to go into their space and allow them to serve their alcohol there, obviously alongside food and therefore within the regulations. So which is obviously great for both customers and the two brands who are able to kind of leverage off each other and build additional custom. One thing that we would say about that is if it continues for the long term in particular, having an association between the two brands in that way, and particularly given the importance of brands to operators in the bar and restaurant industry and the leisure industry more generally, is just to be cautious in terms of the impact that partnering up with another operator could have on your brand. If anything did go wrong and the worst case scenario happened. So if those things are to continue for the long term, then perhaps businesses should be thinking about putting in place agreements which set out what each party is bringing to the table in respect of those partnerships, and controls around how each party is using the other's brand. The other one we're seeing a lot, and which I think will continue certainly as we get towards spring, summer as well, is operators taking outdoor spaces. So where landowners or other operators have large spaces, we're seeing those offering up kind of temporary premises on those outdoor spaces for other operators to come in for a relatively short-term basis and operate their business from there, which is obviously really positive for operators who wouldn't otherwise have access to the outdoor space and therefore potentially wouldn't be able to open to the extent they don't have that, or will be severely limited in how they could operate. So obviously all that's really positive, but it's worth bearing in mind there, particularly for the landowner or operator who is granting that access, that often the operator who's coming onto that land will be effectively piggybacking off your license and therefore could potentially put your license in jeopardy. So businesses who are granting other operators those rights should be thinking about putting something in writing to set out exactly what that operator is allowed to do on their property, to try and limit any risks to the license that they have in place. Because without that, if the person who you're allowed to come onto the property did something which jeopardised your license, then your recourse against them may be restricted. So there's definitely kind of light at the end of the tunnel, and some of the innovative ways that people and operators have come up with to get through this. They've worked, and I think they'll continue into the new year as well. Yeah,
I think the point you made on brand collaboration is really interesting. We certainly saw that a lot. A common feature of the tier 3 restrictions is that alcohol can only be sold with a substantial meal. And so for the brief period of time, for example, that Greater Manchester was in tier 3 before the second lockdown, we saw a lot of operators who were wet-led premises going into partnership with pop-up food operators to provide that substantial meal and to make sure that they were compliant with that new set of regulations whilst it was in existence. And finally, Kevin, if I can just come to you. Again, I mean, redundancy is probably the the word that you use most often. But is there anything brighter on the horizon for employers, do you think?
Well, I think in terms of the positives, I mean, I'm just building on what you just mentioned there. I think what you see in this sector, quite unlike any other sectors really, is how collegiate businesses are. And I certainly see that from an employment and HR perspective. I see a lot of businesses helping one another, whether that's with ideas or sometimes just pro forma documents and things like that. So I think that's something that's probably always been there. I don't know whether that's particular to Manchester, but certainly that element that you've seen really sustain businesses through that, with businesses helping one another. I guess obviously the furlough scheme and that reintroduction is one of the things that leisure businesses have been crying out for, that kind of help. So that is a bright spot on the horizon. As long as I've mentioned before, as long as you know its limitations and you realise the good and the bad in that. I think this whole era has demonstrated for lots of businesses actually how flexible employees are prepared to be as long as you speak to them. I think it's a time where lots of good businesses are able to call on the goodwill that they've built up with employees. Certainly it's easier for those businesses that have got employers that they trust, and where that understanding of those good communications have continued. Employees get it, and so are willing to be flexible. And then you're right. Yeah, I mean, redundancy is one of the things that we're talking about a lot. And I suppose trying to turn what is inevitably a negative into a positive is redundancy is a classified potentially fair reason for dismissal. So you've got your fair reason, which is a big building block in place for doing things right. And there's not, generally speaking, much dispute about that. So as I mentioned before, your only challenge then is to get it right, do it right, time it right, and then actually, at least if you're going to do it, then you do it properly and I guess humanely with the people that are affected. So yeah, I guess there are some bright sparks on the horizon there.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks everyone. I think we'll probably just draw that to a close. Hope those watching have found it useful. If you want to discuss in more detail any of the issues that we've spoken about today, then please don't hesitate to contact us.